Hi, students. This is Dr. Menchaca Banyulo, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Alasdair MacIntyre's approach to Homer. In the excerpt I had you read from his book, Whose Justice with Rationality. And we're going to read parts of the Iliad, but I thought it might be easier if I walked through some of the theory we'll be using with you. Especially because the reading, at least the first time I read it, I remember feeling that it was kind of hard. Whose Justice with Rationality is a book where MacIntyre's trying to I guess maybe refine or to show through examples that allow him to give his theory some motion and application and practice. Things that he expressed in his kind of signature work, After Virtue. After Virtue is something that probably will be read even after we're gone. You know, sometimes you just run into these things that stick around. You know they're going to stick around. This is one of them. It kind of brought back Aristotelian virtue theory in a way that, you know, allowed people working on politics and morals and ethics to go back to Aristotle and work with it again, even though there are, of course, these things about Aristotle that kind of have made him seemingly not useful in modernity. One of them being, you know, his opinions on women or slavery. But I think even prior than that, like in a logical sense, meaning kind of like in the structure of argumentation, is his metaphysical biology, where Aristotle seems to have these ideas about how the human body works and how the human soul works, that he sees as scientific and rational, and that in modernity they just don't track. So in After Virtue, MacIntyre is helping us to work through kind of our own moral language in the ways our moral language doesn't track. And he gives the example of a civilization that is wiped out, right, at its height, and all that's left behind is scraps and rubble. And let's say that over time, you know, the scraps and rubble kind of get covered by greenery, you know, hurt by weather, however you want to talk about it. And then people come back, they discover this civilization's remnants, and they go in and they see, wow, this civilization had all of this amazing technology and sophisticated moral systems, and, you know, on and on and on. But as they're trying to excavate this and put it back together, they quickly run into this problem, which is that they're putting together something that is inherently incomplete. It's just scraps. And you and I both know, if we went through scraps of paper, for example, that had been lying around for a while, we could try to put the paper back together and figure out the message, but some of it would be degraded, some of it would be lost to time. Whatever we were able to come away with would be a really partial and incomplete understanding. And if we try to build on that understanding, build like networks of knowledge, we be building on top of a very incomplete thing, we may end up running into problems because of that. We may end up jettisoning everything that we excavated because it doesn't make sense. Okay, well, what MacIntyre basically says is that modernity, in a way, is built on these fragments of knowledge, of systems that used to be whole. And so when we try to reason morally, we have these hybrids of things that don't really fit together, and that run into contradictions and lack coherence. And, anyone knows, right, just from our experience, what makes a system of thought compelling? Well, typically what makes a system of thought or a worldview compelling is its coherence. And, he says Nietzsche gets us to the point where, Nietzsche looks at the modern West and is like, yeah, this is not coherent. We've got to take another path. And MacIntyre says, yeah, we do. But what if the path is to retrieve something from the past instead of to go forward in the ways that Nietzsche suggests with his ideas about rationality and knowledge? What if there's something that we could rehabilitate or recover? And he thinks this is found in Aristotle. Now, whose justice with rationality is him deploying, right, this theory of, okay, this is a tradition, this is a tradition, this is a tradition, this is how they relate to each other, this is how they move into each other, this is how they succeed, this is how they fail, and kind of inviting us into this account. I'm interested in this for our class for a lot of reasons. We'll talk about those reasons when we're together again, but probably the most important things to front load, to keep in your mind, are, it's important because MacIntyre thinks there's a big connection between practice and theory. And that's something we want to stick with for the whole term. And the other thing we want to stick with is this idea of traditions. And this is where things really take off in terms of your reading. So in this chapter, what I wanted you to focus on specifically is trying to answer the question, what is a tradition? What is the relationship between conflict and tradition? And then, narrowing in a bit more, what does justice mean for Homer, right? And why does that matter? Well, because what you're going to see is that MacIntyre thinks that after Homer, there's a really important moment in the Western tradition where we have what he calls, what's the best way to put it? I guess a choice to make or a conflict to have over the questions raised in Homer's world, in his Iliad and in his Odyssey. And that the way that we answer that ends up mattering quite a bit for how the Western tradition develops. So if you can understand what justice means for Homer, you can kind of understand the ways that people responding to that in the future, even down to our time, right? Because even if they don't see themselves as responding to Homer, they're responding to someone who was responding to someone who was responding to someone who's responding to Homer. And this is where the concept of tradition comes in. Okay, so let's just get that definition on the table. In Whose Justice Which Rationality, MacIntyre says, a tradition is an argument extended through time in which certain fundamental arguments are defined and redefined in terms of two kinds of conflict: those with critics and enemies external to the tradition, who reject all or at least key parts of those fundamental agreements, and those internal interpretive debates inside the tradition, through which the meaning and rationale of the fundamental agreements came to be expressed and by whose progress a tradition is constituted. So what you see in that definition of a tradition, which is really wordy, is that conflict is inherent to tradition. So people think about tradition as being conservative and focused on conserving it in a way, right? There's aspects of that, but it's not just, or it's not meant to be conserving unreflectively. It's you've got to think of tradition as something that is living and that's responding to external critique and internal critique, and that it's reforming, right, in response to these critiques. So conflict is an inherent part of how traditions grow and how they develop. You can have a conflict in a tradition that destroys a tradition because it's unable to respond to the charges against it or the critiques of it. You can have conflict that divides a tradition, where the tradition splits into two. Well, some people will say that Christianity takes a form that we would see as Protestant. Some people will say it takes a form that is Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. And you can see the moments in time when that happens. You can look at any of the political parties in America and you can see a lot of times a story of conflict that leads to some kind of division and rebirth. If this is true about traditions, then think about the Western tradition. We will understand a lot of what we're doing better in philosophy, MacIntyre thinks, if we think about our moral and political questions as the inheritance of conflict from our predecessor cultures. And one of those predecessor cultures is the society of 4th and 5th century Athens. You can see on this account why beginnings matter so much. If you're familiar with the concept of path dependency is an attempt to analyze history or decision making by looking at how what one rejects or chooses shapes the future into, that's some really vague, but in path dependency, it's sort of like, well, the choices that you're making now are a product of choices you made in the past, not only in terms of what you chose, but in terms of what you didn't choose or what you closed the door to. And so you can trace kind of this genealogy of decision making. MacIntyre is basically saying we can trace that in the history of thought in a way where doing so is not just kind of archaeological work. You're doing it to understand the structure of the present, right? Path dependency. How did we get to where we are, right? What are the reasons for this moment, or the stresses or tensions or conflicts in this moment? Homer, for MacIntyre, then, is one of those very early points in the decision tree, right? If we're talking about path dependency. And what Homer posits about the world, about action, about justice, about the human soul, right? It leaves a group of answers, or potential paths, right, for everyone that comes afterwards. And MacIntyre actually thinks that, you know, Pericles is going to inherit from Homer and tries to resolve some of the Homer tensions. Plato is, Sophocles is. These are people, Thucydides. They're kind of in the fallout, right, of the moral world and the conflict that arises in the moral world that lies in Homer's imagination. At this point, it's useful, I think, to just mention Heraclitus really briefly, because if we can talk about Heraclitus, it's going to give us a little bit of a touch point, right, for thinking about, the philosophical underpinnings of Homer. Heraclitus is pre-Socratic, and what he thinks is that change is the fundamental essence of everything. Now, on its face, that may not sound very radical or very, I don't know, significant, but it's quite significant, because what is it that is stable or unchanging about this world? Well, Heraclitus says what's stable and unchanging is that we can realize that change is fundamental to everything around us. Nothing will stay the same. What does this mean about justice? Well, for Heraclitus, this is going to mean that there's not an idea of natural justice that's an idea like order or harmony. Everything is in flux, everything's changing. You can't talk about any sort of norm to guide you other than change itself. And change doesn't have any sort of reason behind it, or moral imperative behind it, other than, you might say, force or power. And so this kind of understanding of the world is one where everything comes to pass in accordance with conflict, and justice is conflict. If you push on it a little further, you'll see that that's because at the essence of the world is flux and instability. So power is kind of the ruler of it all. Ultimately, Plato and Aristotle disagree with this, and that's the important piece for us if we're thinking about things in terms of a tradition. This is the world laid out by Homer. Plato and Aristotle are going to inherit that world and respond to it. But that's where Homer is coming from. That's where the Homeric imagination comes from. Now, MacIntyre does think in our class, we have not spent time yet, a sustained period of time with Socrates, but in his symposium, Plato presents Socrates as explaining that the reason his world view has become what it is, and his soul has become as beautiful as it is in part because of this woman named Diotima. And Diotima is someone who taught him, right, that the love of truth is the sort of highest love. And what does that look like in practice? Well, Socrates says something really important, that she teaches him that instead of breaking the world down like Zeno does into only X and not X, right? So into strict binaries, that when you're engaging in philosophy, the surer thing to do is to say, what in this is true, what in this is false, and to start, right, with opinion, and then to ascend by holding on to the insight, right, that you can get from the opinion. Because there's this idea that insofar as you're reflecting on reality, there is something real and true there. You don't need to leave it all behind. It's not all X and not X. This doesn't mean that something's not true. It means that in the attempt to find what truth is, you can't just dice things up. And MacIntyre takes this really seriously. And he's not just going to be like, Heraclitus, he has this idea about flux. This is the implications of these ideas for justice. These are the way that Socrates and Aristotle come along and they just annihilate Heraclitus. That's not what happens. If you're doing this right, you're going to see that inside everything is something to learn from. And we see in Heraclitus, early on in Western philosophy, there's a link between conflict, understood as change, and justice. And in fact, if you look at the way that Homer depicts this world, conflict's not only divisive, it can also be unitive. Contenders engage in ongoing conflict. And this can actually become a part of how civil and social life becomes ordered. So now we're in the home stretch. We're going to tie all of these things together, at least tie it together enough that we will be able to have a complete, starting point for when we come back to class. Returning, to MacIntyre, how he's conceptualizing all of this. Oh, sorry, that's my dog. He thinks about our current inquiry, philosophical, moral, ethical inquiry, political inquiry, a set of inherited conflicts, inherited debates. And he says the terms of that debate were set by that body of oral and written matter, which provided educated Athenians with those shared understandings without which clearly articulated disagreements and conflicts are impossible. Central to that body of oral and written matter were the Iliad and the Odyssey. You can find parallels here, right, to Augustine and his City of God. Why is he going to bother talking so much about Roman historians and Roman poets? Well, because all of the elite members of his society, all of the people who are engaged in any type of policymaking or reflection or educating along these lines have had these shared texts that comprise a certain vision of Rome. So you're going to have Sallust, you're going to have Virgil, Augustine's going to be going into that structure and spending a lot of time there. And you're like, well, why is he doing that? Well, because this is that body of oral and written matter which provided the educated with shared understandings, that allow them to have a framework of what MacIntyre calls clearly articulated disagreements and conflicts. If you think about Americans and us as Americans, you might notice something similar in that if you go back to Obama's presidency and his time campaigning, he is spending a lot of time developing and thinking about Abraham Lincoln and themes that come from Lincoln. Well, why? Lincoln died a long time ago. Well, it's obvious why, because the people that live presently have inherited a ton of stuff, right? That we live and think of and think through, prism of life, where Lincoln's a big figure. And so, engaging with Lincoln as a figure is something that an American leader would do, not just, to be a historian, but to have meaning and to make meaning in the present and in the now. When we look at the tradition broadly, MacIntyre tells you in this chapter that ultimately he's interested in where Homer can be traced or can be seen as coming alive in Thucydides' work and Aristotle's work. Why? Because to MacIntyre, Thucydides and Aristotle, we could look at them as independent theorists and see their separate theories, their analyses of political power, and think of them as existing as in a vacuum, but they don't. They're both people who have come to these conclusions and these arguments that are best viewed and most coherent if we understand them from the perspective of people who are taking these tensions and problems that Homer brings up or leaves us with and resolving them in a certain way. So you could say that from this perspective, Thucydides walks away from the Homeric world and says might makes right? And Aristotle walks away from the Homeric world, and his idea of what justice is, his argument's going to be that justice is giving each their due. Justice is a rational mean between two extremes. Homer has a fundamental role in this conversation, and it's because for Homer, we start to see that what MacIntyre calls the goods of effectiveness, right? So winning and victory, those are separate from the goods we might think of as moral goods, right? Or good understood as a type of justice. So what happens, MacIntyre thinks, is that if we're going to talk about what's good, we have to talk about what's excellent, right? And what comes up in the Iliad and the Odyssey, though we spend a bit more time with the Iliad, is this sort of big problem of like, well, what about when victory, which seems to be kind of the obvious good, the obvious thing we're aiming at, what about when in order to win, you have to sacrifice other goods, like the goods that we associate with morality, right? So what if it turns out that being good at something doesn't just mean that you have to excel at it, but you have to be the victor, the vanquisher of all others? And what if, in order to do that, right, it makes you the kind of person who's willing to do things that someone else wouldn't do because they think it would be bad to do that kind of thing, right? What are you left with when we can split the good into these separate components? That's the question MacIntyre thinks Homer is illustrating and working out. And then that's the one that he thinks gets inherited, picked up by Thucydides, might makes right, and by Aristotle through Plato. So this is as much as we're going to do right now. It's a dense piece, and I'm just trying to give you enough, right, to be able to work through it. And for your quiz, the answer is Heraclitus.